The wind carried a hush across the high desert that night, as though the earth itself was keeping secrets from men. Samuel Harper moved through the chill like a shadow, his boots sinking in dust that had turned pale beneath the silver glow of a swollen moon. He was a poor rancher, poorer than most, with nothing but a scatter of cattle too lean to fetch much coin, and a cabin that groaned when the wind leaned heavy against it. Yet for all his lack, his soul had one wealth left untouched by time or hardship, compassion that refused to die, no matter how hard the land or the world pressed him down. He had gone out only to mend a loosened fence post, but on that still night he heard something strange, something that pulled at him like a hand reaching through the dark. It was not the call of coyotes, nor the cry of an owl. It was deeper, heavier, a human sound drawn raw from pain. He froze, listening, then followed it across the ridge, where the moon threw long, cold shadows. And there they were. Two figures collapsed by a tumble of rocks, their bodies large enough to seem almost carved from the land itself. Women yet towering, their presence both awe-inspiring and sorrowful. Their dresses, made of rough fabric dyed with faded hues, were torn from struggle, and blood darkened the earth beneath them. They were Apache, their faces marked by both defiance and exhaustion, their long braids fallen across their shoulders like ropes of midnight. Samuel's breath caught. He had heard stories of tribes near the border, tales meant to rouse fear, and yet what he saw was not a threat, but two human beings near death. For a moment he hesitated. To carry them to his cabin might mean drawing trouble upon himself. The law, the settlers, even the tribe, none would look kindly on a poor rancher meddling in what was not his business. Yet as one of the sisters gave a faint, broken cry, Samuel's hesitation crumbled like dry earth. He went to his knees beside them, pouring water from the tin flask at his belt into their cracked lips. One stirred, eyes opening just enough for him to see the gleam of strength buried beneath pain. She whispered something in Apache he did not understand, but the sound of it was soft as a child's plea. He could not leave them. He lifted the nearest one, struggling under her weight, his back straining, but his will refusing to give. Step by slow step he half carried, half dragged her toward his cabin, then returned for the other. By the time he reached his doorway with both of them laid upon his floor, the sky had begun to pale with dawn's promise. Inside the small cabin, the fire still glowed from embers left the evening before. Samuel laid blankets across the sisters, his hands trembling from exertion. He lit a lantern, the glow falling across their faces. They were young, perhaps in their 20s, with the kind of raw strength that life on open land forges, yet their closed eyes and split lips made them look heartbreakingly vulnerable. He tore strips from an old shirt to bind their wounds, boiled water for cleansing, and stirred a pot of thin stew, his every action heavy with the knowledge that this act of mercy might cost him everything. When one of the sisters finally stirred again, she tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. Samuel gently pressed a hand to her shoulder, a gesture meant to soothe. She stilled, eyes on him, wary but not wild. Her gaze lingered long, as though searching his face for malice and finding only weary sincerity. The second sister roused later, her voice rough, her hands shaking as she accepted a tin cup of broth. Between them passed words Samuel could not follow, yet he sensed gratitude in the way their eyes softened. That night, the rancher sat by the fire long after they slept, staring into the flames as though answers might form in the coals. He wondered what storm had brought these women to the edge of his land, and whether it would soon come crashing upon him as well. But the thought of leaving them to die in the dust gnawed at him worse than any fear. He muttered to himself, as though confessing to the silence, "I reckon kindness is all I got left to give, and if it ruins me, so be it." By morning the cabin felt different. The sisters, though weak, moved with quiet determination, their tall frames filling the space with a presence unlike anything Samuel had known. One insisted on standing, though she swayed, and when he tried to help she gave him a sharp glance, proud even in frailty. She managed to carry water from the bucket at the door, each step heavy but resolute. The other sister mended the edge of the torn blanket with a bone needle she carried hidden in her braid, her long fingers deft despite her injuries. Watching them, Samuel felt both humbled and strangely honored, as if his cabin had become a place worth standing in because of the strength now stirring inside it. Later, while he chopped wood, his neighbor Martha arrived on her wagon. She was a sharp-tongued widow, known for speaking plain, and she did not bother softening her voice when she saw the tall women by the doorway. "Samuel, what in heaven's name have you brought into your house?" They'll be the death of you, mark my words. She warned him that sheltering Apaches would bring wrath from both settlers and tribes, that he had little enough without inviting ruin. But Samuel only wiped the sweat from his brow and answered quiet, I couldn't leave them to the coyotes, Martha. That's all there is to it. The widow huffed, muttered of men who let hearts lead them to folly, then drove away, shaking her head. As the day stretched on, Samuel and the sisters worked side by side in uneasy peace. They spoke little, yet small exchanges began to take root. One smiled faintly when he spilled milk, trying to pour it too fast. The other hummed a low tune while mending a fence, a melody that lingered in Samuel's ears long after it faded. He began to notice details that stayed with him. The scar across one sister's arm, the quiet strength in the other's eyes, the way their shadows lengthened against the barn like twin guardians rising tall over his meager land. Yet with each passing hour, a question pressed heavier on him. What would happen when their kin discovered where they had been taken in? Would his small act of mercy be seen as theft, insult, or worse? At dusk, as the sun bled into the horizon, he thought he glimpsed a faint ribbon of dust far off across the flats. He told himself it was nothing, only cattle moving across the distance. But in his heart, he knew the desert did not keep secrets forever. That night he lay awake, the sisters breathing steady on the floor nearby, the fire painting their faces in gold and shadow. He stared at the ceiling beams, listening to the silence broken only by the crackle of wood. The cabin felt both fuller and more fragile than it ever had. He thought of the loneliness that had lived with him for years, the silence that had wrapped him like an old coat, and wondered if that silence had begun to break. Sleep finally found him near dawn. The last thing he remembered was the sound of wind pressing at the cabin walls, as if carrying with it the whisper of hoofbeats still too far to hear. And so the night closed with a fragile peace, but the air beyond the cabin already trembled with the weight of what was to come. The morning broke not with silence, but with a sound that made Samuel's chest tighten. The drum of hooves across the dry flats, a thunder that grew heavier with each breath of wind. He rose from his cot and stepped outside, the sisters already awake, their tall forms standing in the doorway like sentinels. Dust curled on the horizon, a rising veil that told him his fears had not been imagination. Riders were coming, and they were not few. The first horse broke the line, then another, until a full company of Apache riders drew near, their lances catching the pale sun. At their head rode a man whose presence stilled even the restless wind. He was tall, shoulders broad, his black hair bound in braids streaked with gray. His face was carved with years of command, each line on his brow a ledger of choices made and burdens carried. This was a man used to being obeyed, and the weight of his gaze made Samuel feel as small as a boy caught stealing from his father's hand. The sisters stepped forward, their faces a blend of relief and dread. Samuel could see the faint tremor in their hands, though they tried to hide it. One whispered a word in Apache that Samuel did not know, but the way the chief's eyes softened told him it was father. The air thickened, every man in the saddle waiting for the chief's voice. When it came, it was low, steady, and sharp as flint. Why do I find my daughters beneath the roof of a white rancher? His words fell not as a question, but as judgment. Samuel's throat tightened. He could not meet the man's piercing eyes, but neither would he bow his head. He answered plain, his voice rough. They were dying on the rocks. I could not leave them. I gave them water, nothing more. The chief's gaze lingered, cold and heavy. The riders around him muttered, some with anger, others with curiosity. The sisters spoke quickly in their tongue, voices laced with urgency. They told of Samuel's care, how he bound their wounds, fed them from his thin stores, gave his only coat when the night cut too deep. Their words grew soft, their tone trembling, not out of fear, but conviction. Samuel stood unmoving. He had nothing else to offer, no riches, no force of arms. Only the truth that lived in his chest. His poor ranch, his empty cupboards, his calloused hands, all bore witness to a life of survival with little room for pride. Yet here he was, defending kindness as though it were gold. The chief dismounted. The earth seemed to lean with him as he came close, his shadow falling over Samuel. His eyes were not wild with rage, but heavy with the burden of decision. He circled slowly, like a man measuring not only another's stance, but his soul. When he spoke again, the camp fell silent. You gave them life when you could have turned your back. That debt is not small, but debts must be repaid in full one way or another. His words held both promise and threat, like the glint of a blade in half-light. The sisters stepped forward again, their tall frames almost shielding Samuel. They pleaded, their tones rising and falling like wind through canyon walls. One lifted the hem of her dress to show the scar bound fresh with Samuel's torn shirt. Another touched her chest, as though to say his mercy had reached deeper than flesh. Their father's face did not change, but his silence lengthened, and in that silence the air grew taut as a rope. At last he raised his hand. The rider stilled. He looked at Samuel with the gravity of a man about to place a stone that could not be moved. "You are not our enemy. You proved your heart by your deeds. For that, the tribe will not raise hand against you." His words rippled through the men like the sudden easing of a bowstring. But then the chief's voice deepened, carrying a weight none expected. "More than this, you have shown yourself a man who sees with eyes unclouded by hate. Our blood will not be wasted in your dust. One of my daughters shall remain with you, not as a captive, but as a wife, a bond that ties our people and yours." The words struck Samuel harder than any blow. He stood frozen, his breath caught between disbelief and awe. Marriage was not what he sought when he carried them from the rocks. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the enormity of what was placed before him. He looked at the sisters, one with fire in her eyes, the other with a gentleness that seemed to rise like dawn. Both stood steady, waiting, their faces unreadable, yet their hearts laid bare in their silence. The camp murmured with shock. Even Martha, who had ridden out after hearing the hooves, gasped aloud from where she watched at the fence line. To her it looked like madness, yet to Samuel it felt like a choice carved by fate itself. He swallowed hard, words failing him. The chief stepped closer, his voice now lower, almost fatherly. "You live poor, yet with honor. You will not be left empty-handed. You gave life, you shall receive life." His gaze shifted to his daughters, then back to Samuel. "Choose." Samuel's chest ached. He thought of the years of silence on his ranch, of nights spent alone, with only the creak of wood for company. He thought of how the sisters had laughed softly when the milk spilled, how they had stood in his yard at sunrise with strength that humbled him. He thought of the coat he had laid across weary shoulders, not as gift but as instinct, and how that moment had changed the air in his cabin forever. Slowly he nodded. "I accept." The words were rough, almost whispered, but they carried all the weight his soul could give. He did not name which sister, for in that moment it was not about desire, but about surrendering to the bond laid before him. The chief's stern face eased, the faintest shadow of relief crossing it. He raised his hand, and the riders behind him gave a cry, not of war, but of solemn approval. The bond was sealed in silence deeper than prayer. As the riders turned to depart, the chief mounted once more. He looked back only once, his eyes lingering on Samuel with something that might have been respect. "Guard her well," he said, "and may the whisper of mercy you followed grow into a home." Then he was gone, the company vanishing into the horizon's dust like ghosts fading into dawn. The yard fell still. The air smelled of horse and earth, of fire burned low, of change too vast a name. The chosen sister, tall, scarred, yet radiant in her quiet strength, stood at Samuel's side. She did not speak. She did not need to. Their shadows touched on the ground, mingling as the sun slid low. Samuel felt the silence between them, and in that silence bloomed something he had not known in years. Not desire, not possession, but the first stirring of belonging. He turned toward the cabin, its roof patched and weary, its door creaking, yet for the first time it seemed to breathe. She followed, her steps steady, her presence filling the space beside him like a promise. Inside, the fire caught anew, throwing light against the walls. Samuel paused by the hearth, his heart steadying as he realized what had come upon him. His life, once narrow as a dry creek bed, had widened into something vast and uncharted. The sisters had entered his world as whispers of need. Now one remained as a voice of change. The night gathered, but it did not feel empty. Beyond the walls, the land stretched endless, still holding its hardships, still ready to test him. Yet inside, warmth lingered, a fragile warmth born not of comfort, but of courage, the courage to open his door, to choose compassion, to let a stranger stand beside him. And so the poor rancher's cabin, once silent as stone, became the place where two paths met and began to weave into one. The whisper had grown. It had found root. It had become the first breath of a home. If this tale touched your heart, kindly subscribe so you don't miss the next story by the fire.